the material that we're going to cover here, the rise of the Jewish sect. I want you to remember, though, that the context of the rise of the Jewish sects is sort of planted firmly in the Maccabean period. The Maccabean revolt, the Hasmonean dynasty, because it was the Maccabean revolt that quickened the interest and generated a lot of energy among Jews of that period. Remember, it was a grassroots rebellion against the Syrians, who were trying to force their culture and their religion on the Jews, and actually were trying to outlaw what it meant for the Jews to be Jewish. And the Maccabean revolt happens in the middle of that pressure. So it isn't really a very good period for Hellenism. I mean, we're actually talking about Hellenization here, the Hellenistic period, the period when Greek history and Greek culture starts to permeate the Jewish world. Sometimes Hellenization was very strident and almost abusive, and sometimes it was much more tolerant and slow. And the Hellenization process, nevertheless, it marched on. But the rise of the Jewish sects occurs sometime, probably in the 2nd century BC. If you read 1st and 2nd Maccabees, you can recall that there was a group of Jews referred to as the Hasidim. The Hasidim were kind of like a group of purist Jews who were interested in preserving the purity of their religious tradition. Hasidim comes from, it's built upon the Hebrew word, and every Hebrew word, or most Hebrew words, were built on a triliteral root. In other words, most Hebrew words had three consonants, and the words were built on those 3 consonants. The 3 consonants behind the Hasidim was Hesed. If you add vowels, it would be a short E in between them. And this word occurs frequently in the Psalms, translated loving kindness. Loving kindness. So what the Hasidim did is they sort of named their group after one of the attributes of God, one of the beloved attributes of God, one of the attributes of God that's in fact exalted in the book of the Psalms. The word in Greek that probably translates chesed is charis, which is a very popular word in the New Testament. It means grace. So the Hasidim were one of the Jewish sects, one of the early Jewish sects. In fact, the Hasidim were in prominence at the beginning of the Maccabean revolt. By the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, we will have seen several other Jewish sects actually sort of rise to the surface and become prominent players in some of the political battles that were going on during the Hasmonean dynasty, the Pharisees and Sadducees. I mentioned them numerous times last time when I was going through some of the power struggles of the Hasmonean rulers. Sometimes the Pharisees were favored, sometimes the Sadducees. These were called the Jewish sects, okay? We might refer to them as denominations sort of like the denominations of the Christian church in our lives. I have no idea how many Christian denominations there are. I would bet that depending on how you want to define denomination, they're easily in the hundreds. And each one of these denominations in the Christian church has sort of its own special focus, its own reason for being. Sometimes a denomination begins as sort of a descent from another firmly established group, sort of like Methodism from Wesley grew out of Anglicanism, and Lutheran Protestantism grew out of Roman Catholicism, that kind of thing. That's the way denominations sort of grow and develop, and they usually have their own set of special interests, and usually those special interests are praiseworthy, are laudable, right? Don't most Christian denominations, couldn't you say about most Christian denominations that they're all interested in holiness? And frequently when we study the history of the Christian church, we refer sometimes to the holiness movement as though it started in the early 20th century or the late 19th century. But that isn't really true, is it? Holiness? I mean, maybe the holiness movement has a special frame of reference in the 20th century. But you can read the writings of John Calvin, who was one of the reformers, and from whom probably the church in America owes its origins is the Presbyterian Church or the Reformed Church. John Calvin was very interested in holiness. You can't read his writings and not realize that he thought that one of the fundamental pursuits of Christians should be holiness. The same thing could be said of people who disagreed with him, the Anabaptists. And so, for all the reasons that denominations have for splitting off from one another, they all have some reasons for existing that look very similar. And the differences between them become shades of meaning, explaining who they are. The same thing can be true, is true of the Jewish sects that emerged and became prominent in a couple hundred years before the birth of Jesus, and in fact during the life of Jesus. We in fact meet several Jewish sects in the pages of the New Testament. Some of them are very familiar to you, and I don't pretend that this is new to you at all. But frequently, don't we talk about Judaism in the first century as though there was only one form of Judaism in the first century? Don't we often do that? Isn't that a mistake? If there are these different Jewish sects, and each one of them has sort of stepped away from another sect because of some principal interest that they have, wouldn't it be much more accurate for us to refer to Judaisms in the first century and then look at these different sects and what concerned them? Just like if you're going to talk about Christianity in the 20th century, you have to talk about denominations, don't you? How can you not? Judaism in the first century was fractured. I guess that's a word we could use. Fractured, splintered, diverse. Whether you want to give it a bad spin or a neutral spin, diverse is neutral. If fractured sounds too negative, diverse. Just like Christianity today is diverse. If I took, if I tried with this class to try and determine how many different denominations are represented in this student body of 35 students, how many do you think we could find? How many denominations do you think are in this student body of 35 students. How many? 25? 10? 7. The number, the perfect number. 8. Well, let's see. Let's see how many there are. Let's start with the main large denominations, okay? Is there anybody from the Greek Orthodox Church here? No. Russian Orthodox? No. Roman Catholic? No. Lutheran? 1. Presbyterian? We've got Presbyterians here. Reformed? Pretty close to Presbyterian. Reformed. Methodist? United Methodist? 1. Free Methodist? Nazarene? Okay. I used to belong to a Nazarene church, so I guess I can raise my hand for that one. How about Baptist? Okay, we got about 10. Let's see. How about Church of God? Assembly of God? 2. How about Foursquare? If that's enough. Okay, 1. How about Calvary Chapel? That's almost become a denomination. Got a few of those. Can you think of anything else? Any others? Evangelical. Right on. Okay, we got some evangelicals. Actually, evangelical is a kind of an umbrella category that covers a lot of Protestant denominations. But there is a church that's called the Evangelical Free Church. Yeah? I have no idea. No, that's... What church do you go to?
It's called Southeast Christian Church.
Well, you belong...
That's in Parker, Colorado, where I live. Out here, I go to church, the
The
Open Door.
Open Door. Okay.
Or Christ Church of the Valley. I go to
Evangelical is a legitimate category. We could have done that, although a lot of people from different denominations would consider themselves a part of that. So, Open Door. The Open Door Church is kind of a large, almost has denomination status in Southern California. Well, I'm from Nebraska, and when I lived in Nebraska, I'd never heard of it. Yeah.
I don't think anybody claims denomination, so I'm just going to ask your opinion on it. What do you know about the Church of Christ?
The Church of Christ.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's listened to that, but I've started to see some things about that church. Within the church that they believe that you have to be baptized by their church to believe have salvation. I don't know a whole lot about it.
And in some places, that's referred to as the First Christian Church. My brother is a member of the Church of Christ. He lives in Nebraska. And so I'm familiar with that. I'm familiar with that. They think, you were exactly right when you described the Church of Christ as placing some special importance on baptism. Baptism is a Christian ritual that just about, you can find baptism as one of the rituals in almost every denomination. But frequently a denomination attaches some particular importance to its form of baptism, either the way they administer it or the people they administer it to, the results of the administration of the baptism, etc., etc. So that's pretty common, I think. But thank you for bringing that up. The Church of Christ is a denomination. Yeah.
Is Covenant, have you been to anything?
Covenant Church, yeah. They would be sort of similar to the Reformed churches and sort of similar to the Presbyterian, but they are also a separate denomination. Thanks.
I was just going to say also for the Church of Christ, they're not allowed to, I don't know if they're allowed, but they don't have musical instruments that are for the worship.
Really?
Yeah, like
So just this Sunday?
singing. Yeah, just this
Did they have a piano?
No?
No? My brother's churches, the old line, they would allow pianos. My brother is a guitar player, and now he's a pastor in that church, and so they let him play his guitar. I don't know what you know. I imagine rules like that are flexed a little bit. Pardon me? Yeah, they vary. They vary. Just like you find subtle variations in different Nazarene churches across the United States. Did I miss any denominations? Who wants to raise their hand and add another one? I wasn't keeping track. I suppose we had 10 or 15. 11. Okay. 11 out of a class of 35. That's pretty good. That's pretty diverse, isn't it? I've studied a lot of the major denominations of Christianity. And one of the things that you can say about them all is that they were interested in holiness. And the interesting thing is, when I have studied first century Judaism, is that the names of the Jewish sects almost universally reflect an interest in holiness. Sometimes their interest in holiness takes its own special direction. Like it has in the history of Christianity. I know when the holiness movement began in North America, and the Nazarene Church was a part of it, one of the ways they defined holiness was by some of the things that you didn't do, like go to movies, smoke, drink, or chew, or go with women who do. You've heard that, okay? And they even might define holiness, as the use or non-use of certain musical instruments in the sanctuary. They might define holiness as the kinds of things you wear to church. Okay? So these are defined different ways. But turn your course pack to page 6. Page 6. It's interesting. I want to just give you a few examples. Pharisee. I told you that Hebrew words were built upon a three consonant root, and so the word Pharisee, the three roots are P, R, and S. I have some of this written out for you on page 6 of your course pack. The Pharisees were called the Perushim. It's interesting when you look at Perushim and the three consonant root. One of the meanings of parash Perushim, the three letters are this one. This is a P, this is an R, this is an S. What that means is set apart, parash, Perushim. The Pharisees were those who were set apart. Obviously, set apart for holiness. This is the way they described or fancied themselves as having a special interest in holiness. Obviously, you can see that they have some similarities to the Hasidim. The Hasidim were interested in holiness. Now, during the Hellenistic period, when the Jewish traditions were being bombarded by Hellenism, which was very different than it, the preservation of Jewish traditions was one of the ways that they defined holiness. Perushim. Sometimes a P was, if it has a dot in it, it's pronounced P, like a hard labial P. If it doesn't have the dot, sometimes it was softened to an F sound. This is something that you find in some ancient languages. You actually have one letter that can, depending on what word it's used in, can actually look like several different English letters, but P and F are both related letters, even in English. The R sound is pretty much always R. The S sometimes was an S, sometimes it was an SH, which is usually in English, it's an S with a dot under it. Sometimes it's a Z sound, and sometimes it's TS. But most of the words, most of the variations of the word parash that we find have a similarity to one of these sounds in English. This has relevance. I'll get to the point of it in a little bit, okay? So the Pharisees, the Perushim, were ones who were set apart. Look at page 7. I have written down for you the Hasidim, which meant loving kindness, and we've already gone over these, so we're not going to repeat it. But the Hasidim were very much involved in the Maccabean revolt and the victory of these guerrilla fighters over the Syrians and the celebration of Hanukkah. The next Jewish sect that we could look at are the Sadducees. Once again, I'm just looking at their name. The three roots, the three consonants, or the three consonantal root, is S, D, and C. Again, with this S sound, sometimes we have any of these variations. With the D, sometimes the D is softened to a TH. And with C, sometimes it's actually a C sound, like S. Sometimes it's hardened to a K. Scholars have often wondered about the origin of this name, Sadducee, because there are several possibilities. One of the possibilities is that it's related to the Hebrew word for righteousness. The Hebrew word for righteousness is tzedek. Possibly the Sadducees were naming themselves after one of these other very popular words in Jewish theology, and another one of the attributes of God, righteousness, tzedek. It's also possible, and some scholars are convinced of this, that the Sadducees trace themselves back not to this word, righteousness, but back to the high priest during David's time. The high priest, his name was Zadok, and once again you see those three consonants, Zadok. From the time of David onward, if you wanted to be a high priest, you had to be from the line of Zadok. We know that the Sadducees were priests. We know that they were the priests who were the ruling class of priests in Jerusalem. It's very possible that they're tracing themselves back and naming themselves after Zadok, the Sadducees. The Essenes, who are a group that I'm going to talk some more about in just a minute. We're also not real sure about the derivation of their name, but it is possible that it derives from an Aramaic word, hasya, which means pious or holy. I'll return to discussing the Essenes in a little bit. There's another group of Jews that we meet in the Gospels. They're called the Zealots. In fact, one of the disciples of Jesus is called a zealot. His name is Simon the Zealot, not to be confused with Simon Peter. Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were named not after a word in Hebrew, but after a word in Greek. Zelotes. It meant to be zealous. So once again, however, they were named after a sort of a quality that they considered to be a virtue. Now I told you that most of these Jewish sects defined their interest, whether it was holiness or righteousness or piety or being set apart or being zealous. It was zealous or pious or set apart for the particular religious traditions of Israel. They all had that common interest and the preserving of holiness in the lives of the members of their group. Sometimes their interest extended to the use of violence and force. I guess we could almost say that the Hasidim resorted to violence, because weren't they part of the Maccabean revolt? We see them resorting to violence. The Maccabean revolt was actually a guerrilla resistance movement against the Syrians, where they actually engaged in battle to try and salvage and save and preserve their religious traditions. Some of these Jewish sects didn't think that violence was an option. You might call these pacifists. The Zealots were very militant in their use of force. In fact, it's the Zealots, if you were to read Josephus and the history of the Jewish wars, it was the Zealots who actually made the Romans so mad in the 60s that the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem in AD 68 through 70. So the end of Jerusalem in AD 70 was because of the persistence and the militancy of the Zealots. So they were very much in favor of, literally kicking butt to preserve holy traditions. Not all of these guys were, though. Another group that we could talk about, I've got on page 7 several other groups of Jews. We don't hear a lot about them in the New Testament, but we know they existed, and we could call them denominations. The Hasmoneans, the Hellenists, the Herodians. The Herodians were supporters of the family of Herod. The Hasmoneans were supporters of the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hellenists were supporters of the Hellenistic traditions that were being, and some consider the Hellenists to be especially bad. The Baptists. We meet the Baptists in the New Testament. This is Baptists in a different way than Baptists in the Christian church. The Baptists were a group, a Jewish sect, followers of John the Baptist. Arguably, most of Jesus' disciples came from the Baptist movement. Jesus himself was a part of the Baptist movement. But eventually, Jesus and his entourage, his disciples, became known as something other than a baptizing sect. They became known as the Way, and they're referred to as the Way in the book of Acts. The Way. There's another group that we don't hear about in the New Testament, but we know existed because of Josephus, the Sicarii. The Sicarii named themselves after. Remember, they were interested in holiness, in preserving sacred traditions, but they named themselves after a weapon. Sika. It's a knife. You guys have ever seen Aladdin, the movie Aladdin? You know, the curved knife. That was a Sika. It was a curved knife. It was very effective for, offing people. In fact, the Sicarii were professional assassins. This was their modus operandi. This was their special technique. The way that they thought that sacred traditions could be preserved and must be preserved was by doing away with those who were actually promoting Hellenistic traditions. So the members of the Sicarii, and you can read about these in Josephus, they were very discreet. I mean, they would go into Jerusalem like during one of the religious festivals when there were lots of crowds around, and they might have a person targeted for assassination, and they would walk up to them in a crowd, pull out their knife, kill the person, put it back in their coat, and walk away. A walk-by stabbing. We would have drive-by shootings. Today they had walk-by stabbings. And they were performed by the Sicarii. One of the disciples of Jesus that scholars have struggled to understand is Judas Iscariot. Some scholars have suggested that his last name reflects his membership in another Jewish sect, which is called the Sicarii. I don't know. Possibly. I know that Jesus filled his group of disciples with quite a motley bunch of people. He had a zealot. He had a fisherman. He had a tax collector. He had quite a group. They looked very different from each other when they were all together. Maybe one of them was also a former member of the Sicarii. One thing I'm sure of, though, is that most of these Jewish sects had qualities about them that were good. I mean, the Sicarii weren't just, they weren't just anarchists. They weren't just interested in killing people because they just didn't like people. They had some sort of a strategy behind what they were doing, just like the Zealots did in the 50s and the 60s. The three main Jewish sects, and compared to these three, the others were all small. The three main Jewish sects are these: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And so what I'd like to do is take these three main groups and show you some of their differences in belief systems. Okay? It's the chart. I handed out last time, I think a week ago today, I handed out this handout, Josephus on the Jewish Sects. This is just a list of quotations from, does anybody not have one of these? This is just a list of quotations from Josephus, places where he actually gave us information about the different Jewish sects. Josephus himself was a member of the Pharisaic party, but he gives us a lot of inside information on these three sects, and so it's worth having these quotations. Most of what I'm going to put up on the board on this chart, you can distill from these quotations from Josephus. So I'm sort of relying on Josephus for this information. Believe it or not, these Jewish sects had a variety of opinions on this subject of free will or predestination or determinism, as it's sometimes called. And the Christian church is even splintered on this issue of free will and determinism. For example, churches within the Calvinistic tradition do not believe in free will. Churches within the Wesleyan tradition do believe in free will. It's a major theological debate that it goes back to Augustine in the 4th century. It existed among the Jews. According to Josephus, the Sadducees believed in free will. We can call this indeterminism or adeterminism. If determinism is a view of history and fate as being just things that have been preordained and predestined by God to happen, if that's determinism, then the other view, that there is actually free will taking place, that there is actually free moral choices being made by people, that's indeterminism. The Sadducees believed in that. The Essenes, and we know most of what, we know a lot about what the Essenes believed from the Dead Sea Scrolls. In addition, we know a little bit about the Essenes from Josephus. But what we learn from both Josephus and the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they believed in determinism. You might say the Essenes were good Calvinists. Okay? Now, in between these sort of extremes, free will, determinist, are the Pharisees. And we might call these, the Pharisees, believers in synergism, which is a compound Greek word that means work, ergos, ergo, and soon, which means together. Pharisees believed that God was sovereign and that he had an ultimate control over the events of history, but they somehow laced into that the possession of human beings of free will, an ability to either work with or against God. So it was kind of a halfway synergism. Some Christians are right here. They're very synergistic. If you find that one or two of these, or either one of these extremes are just hard to maintain in all of the details, then synergism might be appealing to you. It's what the Pharisees believed. They also had some variations when it came to eschatology. Eschatology is eschatology, strictly defined, refers to the last things, okay? Spencer, does that green show up? No? I guess I won't use green. Last things. For example, some people in the ancient world believed that there was no life after death. That when you die, you die. You know, you turn back into dirt like a cow. Others in the ancient world believed that we possessed something within us that was eternal and that would last forever. And so they believed that the death of the body was just another phase in our experience of some sort of life. The Sadducees denied an afterlife. The Sadducees denied that we possessed a soul. We were immortal beings. Okay? The Essenes believed in immortality of the soul. That when you died, your soul was released from the body. To experience either joy or torment, one or the other. The Pharisees, they believed in a soul and life after death. They also believed in something that was a little bit different than this, and that is resurrection of the body. So that actually in the, in the last state, our physical bodies, even though they perish and disintegrate, they're somehow going to be revived, given a new sort of form. And once again, we will have, we will experience, we will have a bodily experience, even though it's a little different than the bodily experience we would have now. This perspective is very Greek. In fact, Plato, 400 BC, Socrates, Xenophon, the Orphics, Platonists, they all believed in the immortality of the soul. And in this sense, the Essenes reflect much similarity to this Greek doctrine of life after death. On the other hand, this one here is very Jewish, very Mosaic, very Old Testament. When you die, you go to Sheol. Nothing happens in Sheol. That's just where the shades of the dead go. Your ancestors, you die. This view right here of life after death and some sort of resurrection of the body has elements of many different cultural beliefs systems within it. In fact, in the ancient world, the Persians, and their religion is Zoroastrianism, they believed in life after death. They also believed in a resurrection of the body. And we see this preserved in post-exilic Judaism. Okay, what about what these different sects believe regarding scripture or tradition? The Sadducees believed in written tradition only. In fact, they would even narrow that down, and they regarded as sacred tradition only the books from Moses, the Torah. Now, there might be levels of sacred traditions in the prophetic literature and the wisdom literature, but as far as something having the stature of Scripture, it was only the Torah. And it was only a written tradition. The Essenes, they accepted Moses. They also accepted the prophets. And the writings. But in addition to these books that we're familiar with as being part of the Old Testament canon, the prophetic literature, the writings, the Torah, the Tanakh in Jewish parlance. The writings, well, the prophetic literature, the writings are like the Psalms, Job, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Song of Solomon. In addition to these, the Essenes also had a vast collection of secret books. We found this out in the 1940s when archaeologists discovered a whole library hidden on the west bank of the Dead Sea in caves. 800 volumes. In the Dead Sea Scrolls. A whole library of sacred literature that the Essenes hid before the Romans attacked them and destroyed them. So they had a vast collection of sacred traditions. If you ever get a chance, I would encourage you. Now we have like 99.5% of the Dead Sea Scrolls translated into English. And you can go and buy a copy of the complete Dead Sea Scrolls. And to not do so is foolish, in my opinion. It's fascinating reading the things you learn about Jews in the first century from reading this literature. It's very, very interesting. In between the Sadducees and the Essenes, we have the Pharisees, who believed in a written tradition, but they also believed in an oral tradition. We find out more about what the Pharisees believed in regard to this when, after AD 70, the Pharisees were sort of the only Jewish sect that survived the Roman war. So Judaism, after AD 70, owes its existence to the perseverance of the Pharisees. And by the 2nd and 3rd century AD, the Pharisees actually translated what we know existed in the 1st century during Jesus' life as oral tradition. It was translated, and you can even get a copy of it in the library because it's been translated into English. It's called the Mishnah. And it represents a whole collection of oral tradition that the Pharisees believed went all the way back to Moses. They called it the Oral Torah. So not only did God give Moses the written Torah, but he also gave him the oral Torah. And the oral Torah was passed on from teacher to disciple, orally. On numerous places in the Gospels, we'll find Jesus referring to their traditions. And this is what he's referring to. These oral traditions, which they considered to be as sacred as the written Torah. Number 4, the social demographic. We can cover this a little bit quicker. The Sadducees were upper class. They were wealthy priests living in Jerusalem, and they were very powerful. They controlled the temple. The Essenes, it's hard to say whether the Essenes were upper class or what, because I guess the best word that we could say for the Essenes, if we talked about their social demographic, is that they were separate. In fact, we might call the Essenes, if they were to live in our day and age, and we were, to see them, we might call them a cult. Because they actually left civilization and they went and lived by themselves. They formed their own little community and they kept to themselves. They forbid any sort of commercial or material interaction with those outside the cult, outside of the sect. They were also priests. In fact, we think that the Essenes, the ones who lived in the Dead Sea community called Qumran, Qumran is the name that we have given to the community where we think these people lived who hid the Dead Sea Scrolls. We think that the priests actually left the community of priests in Jerusalem sometime during the Hasmonean dynasty. Remember, I was explaining to you how some of these Hasmonean rulers were actually crossing the line, calling themselves king, taking the office of high priest, when they actually had no right to do so within the stream of the sacred tradition in Israel. They had no right to do these things. So when they started to do these things, some of the priests in Jerusalem left the city. And we think it's it was from that group that the Essenes were formed out in the area, the desert by the Dead Sea. So they were a separate group. They were still a community of priests. When they joined the community, they turned over all of their earthly possessions. And so they didn't own anything. I mean, when you join the community, you turn over everything you own. And that's why in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in fact, there's even there is some discussion in the scrolls about a rich treasury that the Qumran community had hidden somewhere. And it represented all of the worldly wealth of the people who turned over all of their stuff to the community. And it was hidden. And so there was a lot of, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was an awful lot of treasure hunters out in Israel looking for the lost treasure of the Qumran people. What did they do with all their money? The Pharisees were lower class. They were lower class. Typically, they were poor. They had no money. And they were not priests. They didn't belong, or they didn't come from the priestly line. But they lived their lives according to the requirements of the priesthood. So they felt as though, if this level of behavior and righteousness is demanded of the priesthood, then it should be followed by every Israelite. And so they were very strict in the way that they lived. Their levels, their demands of holiness were very high. In fact, Jesus even says at one point in the Gospel of Matthew to his disciples, "Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, the Pharisees were very concerned about holiness. Very concerned. They were the fundamentalists of the first century. So when Jesus said to his disciples, "Your righteousness must exceed theirs," he's making some significant demands on his followers. The behavior, we know a little bit about their behavior. Of course, you have to imagine that the behavior of any of these groups is sort of prone to whatever temperament the individual has. But as a group, we might say that the Sadducees were snobs and rude. That the Essenes were generous and compassionate. Because they put no value at all in worldly things. The Pharisees were very harmonious and polite. This discussion of behavior is very general. Of course, we don't know a lot about how each of these. We do have, particular examples. For example, we have only one place where Jesus actually encountered Sadducees in the Gospels, and they were very rude to him. They were very rude. Anyway, I have a question for you guys. You know right now a lot more about the Jewish sects than you did when you walked into this classroom this morning. You know a lot about the different kinds of Jews that were running around the streets of Judea, of Jerusalem, in the first century. So you know now about a lot of the possibilities. I mean, if we're going to profile Jesus, what kind of Jew does he look like among all these varieties? What does Jesus look like to you? Which one of these groups? An Essene? Okay. Do you guys all agree with that? Do you think Jesus looks like the Essenes? Okay. Anybody want to contest that? Huh? Pardon me? She suggested that Jesus looks more like an Essene than either one of these.
I think that Jesus probably looked a lot like a lot of people were saying that maybe John the Baptist come back from the dead, like they were seeing
Mhm.
like that in the Bible. And I know that a lot of maybe they thought that John the Baptist was Essene. Maybe he lived out in the wild by himself. He had a group of people where he's baptizing them. And so I think that maybe he looked like, John the Baptist looked like Essene, and they're comparing him to John the Baptist. So.
Okay. A Pharisee? Anybody vote for Pharisee? Who votes for Essene?
How could he be like the Pharisees if in a lot of his teachings he doesn't condone what the Pharisees do?
She asked, how could he look like a Pharisee when in so many of his encounters or his he's in such opposition to them? Yeah.
But he doesn't follow them. That's just, I don't know, there's three up there and he's talking about people. He's really got and I mean, he does talk about, again, they like prayers from the Pharisees, so I don't know, none of them are and I think you may like agree with the ideology of a group, but in every group, like he's not gonna like the corruption that exists within that group. He's supposed to want to that kind of like their foundation.
Okay. The determinism of the Essenes is interesting. In some places in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it talks about how members of their sect have to satisfy some of the requirements that they think are actually built into the human persona. This is one of the reflections of their determinism. For example, if you had deformed hands or, weird feet or a strange face, some of your guys' noses don't look that normal. The Essenes might say, judging by the appearance of your nose and the way your eyebrows come together and one ear is lower than the other, we don't think that you're one of God's elect. They in fact did this. This was part of their understanding of determinism. Determinism wasn't just God was in control of sort of the cosmic energy of the universe. Determinism extended even to his giving to you facial defects in order to eliminate you from the elect. Does that sound like Jesus to you? No. How about immortality of the soul? There is in all of the 800 volumes of Dead Sea Scroll literature, there is no mention anywhere in any one of them about a resurrection of the body. But what did the Sadducees actually address Jesus with? There is one encounter that Jesus has with the Sadducees. They asked him this question: Jesus, you're so smart. Let's say A man has 7 brothers. He marries this woman. He dies before they can have a child, so the woman becomes the wife of his brother. Then he dies before they can have a baby, so she becomes the wife of the next brother. Then he dies, and on and on and on. She goes through all the brothers, okay? They say, whose wife will he be in the resurrection? Now, of course, the reason for actually setting that whole question up was to show how ludicrous they thought it was to talk about a resurrection of the body, as though there was some sort of transference of things, experiences of this life to the next. And why would they ask him that question? Oh, it must have been because he said something about resurrection. No? Yeah. I don't know, guys. I guess I would cast my vote for Pharisees. That of these groups, these large groups of whom we know the most, Jesus looks most like the Pharisees, which sort of raises the question that I'm glad you brought up. And that is, if Jesus looked like the Pharisees, if he would have been considered like a Pharisee-like by other contemporaries of his, why would he have such venomous contact and arguments with Pharisees? It's a good question. I'm glad you asked the question, in fact, because it gives me an opportunity to say, to make a suggestion to you. Maybe the conflict that we see so frequently happen in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, especially in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, where Jesus really lays in to the Pharisees. Maybe this contact that we see happening so frequently between Jesus and the Pharisees, and the conflict that is generated by their encounters, maybe instead of it being the way we usually imagine it, as being Jesus against them, sort of an us-them conflict, maybe it's more of an in-house conflict between two arguing members of a very similar-looking sect. Let me elaborate on this a little bit more. You know, I grew up in the Christian church. One of the worst things that you can say about anybody is to call them a Pharisee. No? Primarily because we see Jesus going toe-to-toe so often with Pharisees in the Gospels, calling them hypocrites, judging them severely for some of the things that they do, the ways that they behave towards others. Okay? Is it possible that because of the predominance of conflicts that Jesus had with the Pharisees, that we have misunderstood them? That we have categorized them as the arch enemies of Jesus, when instead of it being an us against them kind of thing, it was an in-house conflict between quarreling members of a similar sect. Let me show you a few things. Can you think of any Pharisees in the Gospels that were sensitive or even responsive to Jesus? Can you think of any? Now, I can't show you any Sadducees that he actually had this sort of discourse with. Uh-huh. Good point. Okay. Let's just, Jesus and the Pharisees. Dinner. He doesn't have dinner with them in Matthew. She said, wasn't he invited to dinner? And the answer is yes. He never eats with them in Matthew. He doesn't eat with them in Mark. He doesn't eat with them in John. But 3 times he eats with them in Luke. Luke chapter 7, 11, and 14. 3 times Jesus is invited to the house of a Pharisee to share a meal. 3 times. Now, when you look at those 3, it's kind of fun. Because every time Jesus goes into a Pharisee's house and shares a meal with them, he does something to make them mad, which kind of gives you an idea that Jesus was kind of ornery. You know, most of us think, we see Jesus as this gentle, sort of peace-loving person. He's got a lamb on his shoulders, and he's walking along, and he's got a child at his side, and people come up and bless you, you know, and all this. But what about this picture, okay? What about this picture? A Pharisee comes up to Jesus in the synagogue and says, "Teacher, Rabbi, I would be honored if you would come and have a meal with me in my house." Jesus says, "Okay." He comes over there. Everybody's coming into the Pharisee's house, and they're all doing the sorts of things that you should do. You know, they're washing their hands. Now, they didn't wash their hands to kill the germs. They washed their hands because it was a ritual, okay? But Jesus walks in, and he doesn't wash his hands. Now, do you think he was just kind of stupid about this? Did he just not know that you were supposed to wash? Or what? No, he knew. He was provoking a situation. If you want to read about it, read these 3 encounters. Luke chapter 7, 11, and 14. Every time Jesus goes and has a meal with a Pharisee, he does something to tick him off. Intentionally. What a guy, huh? You guys know Luke chapter 7. It's where he goes to the Pharisee's house. The Pharisee's name is Simon. And while Jesus is having a meal with him, this woman from town comes into the house, and everybody there knows who she is, okay? She's a prostitute, okay? She's a sinner from town. They all know her. She comes in, and she sits down at Jesus' feet, and she's brought this oil to anoint him with. But instead, she starts crying, and she washes his feet with her tears, and she dries them with her hair. And and Simon and all the others, they're ready to nail Jesus. First of all, the people are saying Jesus is a prophet, and Simon's thinking to himself, "I know he's not a prophet. If he was a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this is, and he wouldn't let this happen." You know, it's really funny when you look at that meal in chapter 7. Jesus is the only one in that room who was comfortable with the way things were going down. Because he knew what had just happened to this woman. She had just experienced forgiveness. She had repented. She had been given a second chance. And it's one of the classic exchanges between Jesus and the Pharisees, Luke chapter 7. Because Jesus uses it to explain that the real signal, the real sign that a person has experienced forgiveness is the love that they show to others. And so he makes this woman an example of true love, much to the shame of Simon. Anyway, Jesus does this. So anyway, okay, dinner. Yeah, he has dinner with some Pharisees. They turn out to be circuses, but he has dinner. Anything else? I have to wrap this up. So I have 7 minutes left, and I'll finish this. But Can you think of any? Well, what about Nicodemus? Nicodemus. In the Gospel of John, according to the Gospel of John, Nicodemus was a Pharisee. In fact, he was one of the leading Pharisees. He was probably a member of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the ruling body of the Jews. He was one of the leaders. He was afraid to come and talk to Jesus during the day, but he did at night. What about another Pharisee? Joseph of Arimathea. Mark chapter 15, verse 43. What about another Pharisee? His name is Gamaliel. We meet him in the book of Acts, chapter 5, verse 33. Gamaliel was one of the leading teachers in Israel. He was one of the premier teachers among the Pharisees. And he advised that this whole movement of followers after Jesus, that you should really give it a little bit of time because God might actually be behind this. Interesting, huh? You can't find any Sadducees who are in favor or have a positive discussion, relationship with Jesus. But you can Pharisees, quite a few in fact. And what about another guy? His name is Paul. You know, it's interesting. You can look at all of Paul's letters, and you'll never find Paul ever being ashamed of having been a Pharisee. Isn't that interesting? Isn't it interesting that the Jewish man who became the missionary to the Gentiles, who spearheaded the growth of the early church in the Roman world, was a Pharisee, and he was never ashamed of having been a Pharisee? Now, if being a Pharisee was so bad, doesn't that seem odd to you? What about this? I want to show you something else. In Romans chapter 1, Paul says, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, a called apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. That's the first line. Set apart for the gospel of God. What does set apart? You remember what I said about the Pharisees? What does Pharisee mean? Parash, perushim. What does it mean? Set apart. So you read this. Now, doesn't that make you wonder, okay, set apart. Paul describes himself in Romans chapter 1, verse 1, as a called apostle set apart for the gospel of God. But do you know what's even cooler? Paul found a word in Greek that had the same three consonants as parash, and it meant set apart. So this is what it looks like when he says set apart, for the gospel. It's the word aphorizo. Aphorizo. Now remember what I told you about the letters P-R-S? Sometimes S is a sh, sometimes it's a z sound, sometimes the P is an F. Okay? Look at it. P-H, R, Z. Aphorizo. This is the way Paul describes himself as an apostle. I am a Pharisee for Jesus. Aphorizo. So maybe we need to give the Pharisees a little slack and understand that some of the heated conflict between Jesus and them was in fact an in-house conflict. Jesus was actually having meaningful conflict, except the Pharisees weren't his, prime enemies. In fact, if you took all of the Jewish sects of the first century, it is the one sect that Jesus looked the most like in terms of belief. So we've gotten now to the end of our discussion of the Jewish sects, and I cast my vote for saying that Jesus looks a lot like the Pharisees did. And maybe we need to just cool our jets a little bit in our condemnation of them and realize they might have had some good qualities. Okay, I'll see you guys Thursday.